Part 37, the last part of Book 1. Then the wolf above me leaned down slowly and licked the side of my jaw. I stiffened, waiting for a bite to follow, but it didn't. The wolf nudged my cheek and I turned slowly, reaching out and sniffing him. My mind tried to place the smell. It seemed so familiar, but I couldn't remember. He gave a soft whimper that seemed sad, and I repeated the sound, trying to say I couldn't remember. He snorted then, a hint of anger in it, and I stiffened. The leader barked and I turned to him. He walked over so that he towered over me, and I lowered my head instinctively. A flash of memory crashed into my mind and then was gone just as fast. But something lingered. The fear was slowly fading. My hackles were completely down now, and I whimpered again. The pack leader lowered his head and gently put his mouth over the back of my neck. His teeth did not hurt, but the message was clear. I was his. I stayed still, no muscle moving, to show my understanding. When he finally let go, I felt a sense of happiness rush over me, and I looked up at him. He was magnificent, strong, and wise, I could tell. I felt a pull deep inside of me, and knew that I would follow him anywhere. I sat up slowly, careful to show I was no longer a threat. I wanted to be closer to him. I needed to be. My stomach growled again, but I ignored it. A body pressed against my side, but my eyes were focused on this amazing wolf before me. I sat all the way up, and he moved towards me. My body shivered with excitement as he rubbed his face alongside mine. I closed my eyes, gently pushing back on him, and whimpered as the feelings rushed through me. He turned and licked my muzzle, and I stood, ignoring the soft growls behind me. My tail was still down to show my submission, but my heart was pounding fast. When he was done, I moved forward and rubbed my face along his, letting very low, very soft rumbles come from my throat. My emotions were exploding, and I knew I would never leave his side. Something happened inside of me then. It was as if I could hear his heart beat, and then his heart was beating with the exact same rhythm as my own. I felt a warm rush move over me, internally and then externally. We were somehow connected now, and I felt a happiness swell inside of me. There was a sharper bark behind me, and then my leader growled, but this time not at me. I cowered a little, but up against him. He pushed back against me to show he was not angry with me. Another bark from one of the others, and I moved closer, worry confusing me. I lowered myself halfway to the ground, my tail down. Didn't they want me too? The wolf next to me lowered his head and growled at the other one, keeping his body pressed against mine for comfort. A wolf came back in, carrying another rabbit. My head turned, and I watched him drop it in front of the leader. Then he trotted over to sit with the others. I looked at it, mouth watering again, but I didn't move. He lowered his head and pushed the kill towards me, then twisted his neck and licked just below my ear. I crept forward a little, keeping lower than him, and pulled the rabbit back to me. I laid down, still pressed against his legs now, and ate. I listened to the others moving around further in the den, but the feel of my leader against me made me feel safe and happy. I stopped only after eating half and looked up at him. He turned to me and lowered his muzzle towards me. I reached up and licked it. He nuzzled my jaw, and I closed my eyes. the feelings sweeping through me again. My entire body shivered and a soft noise came from my throat. A loud bark stopped me, and my wolf leader turned quickly, lowering his head, his teeth bared at the other. I shrank again, flattening myself to the ground. Then another noise froze me in my spot. It came from behind us. My wolf turned quickly and faced the opening, growling low and deep. Then he looked down at me and gave a soft bark. My ears perked up. I understood it. "Get back," it said. I scooted back a bit, still keeping even with the ground as much as I could. He stepped in front of me and sent another bark of warning out. I was afraid now. Not of these wolves anymore, but of what was out there. It smelled different, and there seemed to be several of them. My wolf gave another soft bark, and I obeyed and stood and backed up further. He stayed where he was, and two of the others trotted over and stood next to him. The others were still a bit behind me, including the dark one that made my wolf angry. I didn't like him. I wanted my wolf happy. He didn't make him happy right now. I couldn't comprehend why he would do that. I watched my wolf's body as it stood there protecting us. He was so strong, a true leader. Why would any wolf want to anger him? Then the wolves up front began to growl together, warning the outsiders not to approach. My tail dropped and I shivered. My wolf seemed to sense it and turned to look at me. Then he looked at the others and barked. They moved up next to me, and his look told me they would protect me. I didn't glance at the others that stood at my side now. My eyes were locked on the golden wolf ahead of me. I heard more sounds outside and then felt a nudge at my side. I turned then, and the dark wolf nudged me, trying to push me back further. I listened, turning only long enough to walk a few paces back to the nest. I stepped down into the dipped earth and then sat, again turning and watching the wolf I still could smell on me. Then I saw forms outside. Two of them were walking towards the cave. My wolf and the other two lowered their front halves and growled louder. My wolf barked several loud warnings. Then the odd creatures turned and left. I lifted my nose and sniffed the air. Their scent was fading. I was filled with pride. Finally my wolf turned. The other two stayed. He walked towards me and I stood, waiting for him. When he reached me, he ran his body against my side, pushing against me, and I pushed back. Then he turned and rubbed again, covering me in his scent. He licked my neck and then cleaned the wounds his other wolves had made. I stayed still, relishing the feeling and attention. Finally he barked, and the two back in the den moved out and then disappeared outside. My wolf pushed my head down, and I laid down. He laid next to me, keeping his head up and facing the front. I nuzzled under his neck, and he rubbed against me. I felt a happiness I had not known before. I wanted to be with him forever, and I could tell he felt the same way. When I lowered my head, I laid it on his front legs. He licked the top of my head, my ears, and the back of my neck. I closed my eyes and fell asleep, completely and utterly content. I was nudged awake a little while longer, a little while later, his nose gently pushing against my neck. I opened my eyes and then yawned and sat up. He was right there, rubbing against me, letting me know that I was his. I ate the large rabbit that one of the other wolves brought me, and my wolf ate two in the same time. Then I was thirsty. I looked out towards the opening and then up at him. His brown eyes were drinking me in, and I gave a happy bark. He replied and then stepped up out of the dip and looked back at me. My tail went up, and I trotted after him. When we reached the opening, he sent two others out first. I heard them scout the area, and when they barked, my wolf walked out calling to me without a sound. I was at his side as we walked, staying as close as our gaits would allow. His eyes darted everywhere, but he would press against me, and I would nuzzle him as often as I could. When we reached the water, he stood over me while I drank my fill. Then he drank. We were headed back towards the cave when a howl came from our left. The pack froze mid-stride. I looked in the direction it came, then back at my wolf. His head was still turned that way. Another howl came from the distance, and he nipped me gently. We ran back to the cave, and he herded me back to the nest. This time, all of them moved to the entrance, standing side by side. I sat down watching, confused and worried. Another howl from out there, this time closer. I stood. Then my wolf lifted his head and howled back. Why could I only understand some of his sounds? But I shook my head. I could understand when they were directed at me now, and that was all that mattered. He turned, looking over his back at me, and I wanted to go to him so badly. He gave a soft bark, letting me know it was okay. I barked back, but still stood. Then there was another bark, just past where I could see. My wolf didn't growl. He stood there with the others and waited. I lifted my nose and sniffed. I could smell them now. 2 of them, and they were wolves. I felt more confident. 2 against 5, 6 counting me. I sat down. This should be over quickly, and then he would come back into me. I saw the 2 wolves then. They were both very large. One was ashen color, and one was brown. No matter their size, we were in here, and they were outnumbered. I lifted my chin and kept my eye on my wolf's back. If they tried to hurt him, I would attack. No one would come between me and my wolf. That thought sent a wave of anger through me. Again he sensed this and turned and looked at me. I stretched my neck out towards him and gave a soft bark. He replied, comforting me with his sounds. The 2 larger wolves moved closer and stood only a few yards in front of my wolf and the other. They were silent a long moment, and then I heard a low growl, coming from the ashen large one. The others alongside my wolf seemed to cower a bit, and my eyes narrowed. What were they doing? The large one looked past them all, to me. His eyes met mine, and I lowered my head, not able to do any different. What was going on? Then he walked through the others, right past my wolf, and over to me. My head was down then. I saw his forelegs and paws. They were massive in front of me. He was quiet for a long time, and all I could think about was my wolf. Why wasn't he coming to me? Why wasn't he here next to me? I heard a soft growl then from my wolf. The one in front of me lowered his muzzle and gave a low, soft bark. I froze. I didn't understand it, and I was afraid. I shivered a little, but kept myself low and still. He turned then and barked at the others. They all came over, including the one that had come with him. My wolf moved next to me then. As soon as I felt him touch me, I stopped shaking. Keeping my head low, I moved my head towards him, putting it under his neck. He gently pressed down on me, holding me to him. There was more silence then, but I didn't care. I inhaled my wolf's scent and focused on the touch and the sound of his heart beating against my jaw. Then the massive wolf gave a low growl, and my wolf responded, although his was a little less aggressive. Suddenly, the ashen wolf lunged and toppled my wolf to the ground. I was knocked backwards, but leapt to my feet and went to attack. The other huge wolf hit me in the side and threw me to the ground. I yelped, and my wolf barked loudly, calling to me. I jumped up, trying to shake myself off, but the other wolf bit my hind leg. I yelped again and jumped forward to get out of his teeth. I barked over and over again, calling to my wolf as this one bit me and kept me moving forward. My wolf growled, and so did the one that had attacked him. I needed to go back. I needed to protect him. I bared my teeth and turned, ready to pounce. Then I screamed in pain as teeth came down hard on my backside. I lunged forward to get away from the attack. I didn't realize I was outside the cave until something fell over me. It was heavy and blocked everything. I bit and clawed at it, feeling it wrap around me. Finally, I was pinned inside of it, not able to move. I barked loudly over and over. Then I grunted as I was lifted. I heard my wolf bark in response, and then I heard him howl. It was a howl of rage and frustration. It made my throat tighten and my heart squeeze inside my chest. I barked again and then felt something clamp over my muzzle. I tried to shake my head to free it, but I couldn't move. What was happening? They were taking me away from my wolf. Panic and rage seared through me. I twisted and turned, trying to free myself, but the thing had me tight. "Help me!" I tried to bark, but couldn't. "I will come for you," came the howl. And finally, I stopped struggling. My wolf would come for me. He would rescue me, and that was all I needed to know. "I will come for you." I was sweating and breathing hard under the heavy cloth thing that held me so tightly. The air was hot and I was soaked. I heard a humming sound and then was lifted and landed hard. Something rumbled under me, a machine that triggered memories of the two-legged creatures that had chased me. But I laid still, trying to breathe in the hard air. My wolf would come for me. He would rescue me and we would be together. That was all that mattered. I closed my eyes and stayed still for what seemed a very long time. Then I was lifted again and carried. There were sounds around me that were not wolf sounds. Where were the two massive wolves that had taken me? I was jostled around as they moved, and finally I was put down. The thick cloth was moved just enough to expose my nose, and I panted and gasped to get the fresher air into my lungs. I had soaked the covering around me, and my heart raced as I overheated under it. Slowly it was pulled back all the way, although I was held down by the things that did not feel like paws. They could do what they wanted. My wolf would come and make them all pay for this. The cooler air did feel good, though, and then I yelped as cold water was poured over my back. It would have been a welcome relief if it were under different circumstances. I opened my eyes and tried to look around. Something was holding the back of my head down hard, and I couldn't move it. I was still panting hard, trying to cool myself off. The pressure on my head eased just enough for me to open my mouth and pant harder to help. The sounds whirred around me. There were so many that I couldn't count or sort them out. A hand moved close to my head, and I snapped at it. The pressure on my head shoved my jaws shut with a snap. It was the two-legged creatures then. They had taken me. But what about the larger wolves? Were they in a pack together with these two-legged ones? Some strange pack that went around taking other wolves? Why? What did we do to them? My internal wolf mind could find no reason for what they had done. Then I felt something sharp in my backside and I cried out, jumping as much as my restraints would allow. A few seconds later, the images in front of me started to blur. My breath slowed, and then my eyes closed. Chapter 24. When I came to, my head was still fogged and I couldn't move. My mind tried to focus and remember what had happened. I sniffed at the air and took in the scents. I was lying on something soft, but it wasn't ground or leaves. I tried to force my eyes open, and finally they responded. The images were still blurry, and I blinked hard as they came into focus. There was a thick ground under me, and past that there were long, shiny things. Bars! The realization hit me hard. How did I know what they were? I wasn't sure, but I knew it was a bad sign. I focused on my muscles then. They didn't want to move at first, and then they twitched a little. I heard a sound, but couldn't move my head to follow it. Then something moved in my line of vision. It was on the other side of the bars. It knelt down, and I tried to curl my lips at the two-legged creature. A gargled growl crept out of my throat, and then my back leg moved. I continued to move my muscles, my eyes locked on the thing in front of me. Finally, my growl grew stronger, and my head moved with it. The creature was looking at me, eyes tight, mouth moving. It was making the sounds I could hear, but couldn't understand. I lifted my head as much as I could and sniffed. Where was my wolf? I heard a whimper that came from me, and I felt an ache and a need that crushed around me. I yearned for him to the point where it hurt somewhere deep inside. I could smell him, but only on my own fur and in my mind. I closed my eyes and saw him there. I needed to be with him, but he said he would come. I opened my eyes again and growled louder. Then I was able to roll from my side to my stomach, my head bobbing a little. This thing in front of me had dark hair, and its eyes widened and narrowed as its mouth moved. I shook my head hard, which almost knocked me back over, but I felt my strength coming back. I put pressure on my front legs and pushed up, trying to sit up. I fell back down twice before I succeeded. I had to sit there and rest, panting hard from the effort, but I was up. When my wolf came for me, I would be ready. Then another form walked over. This one I knew. It was the massive ash-colored wolf. I bared my teeth and barked loudly at it. It gave one hard, loud bark, and down my head went. That confused me. Another bark, and my head lowered again. I remembered this scene all too well. I glanced behind me and saw only walls. At least there was no other wolf back there to bite me this time. When I turned back, I was careful not to look directly up at this wolf. He was powerful, and not just in size. Something about him told me that. I wouldn't be challenging him for my escape. He paced in front of the bars, glancing between me and the two-legged thing that sat a few feet back. The odd one still made sounds I did not understand, and the wolf would bark in reply. They were in this together. Why would a wolf do such a thing? I saw something out of the corner of my eye and turned. There was a large bowl on the floor, and I saw the surface of the water in it. My mouth was suddenly very dry. I turned and walked over to it, sniffing it before I drank. When I finished, I moved back to the soft thing that I had sat on, looking at nothing and thinking about only one thing, my wolf. When I couldn't take it anymore, I stood and stared and started to pace. When I got too close to the bars, the large wolf came up and gave a soft bark. I flinched, lowering my head, but he pushed his muzzle closer. I wouldn't attack him. Something inside of me told me that. Instead, I turned and paced the other way. Finally, I gave up and went and laid on the soft area. I put my head on my front paws and waited. He would come. He said he would come, so I would wait. The time passed slowly, and suddenly another two-legged thing came in. It had another bowl in its hand. I sniffed the air. This one had food. I eyed that bowl. Then the large wolf came to the bars and gave a loud growl. I shrank from it, and the bars opened. My head went up, and I got ready to lunge, but they closed too quickly. The bowl of food now inside with me. I watched it, but didn't move. I closed my eyes and remembered eating next to him, feeling his fur against me. Another soft cry came from my throat, and I turned my head, laying it on my paws. My heart ached so deep that I couldn't have eaten even if I wanted to. More time passed. I ignored the things on the other side. They paced too, both the wolf and the three upright creatures that were there now. I had my head away from them and stared at the wall, focusing on him and only him. When I did look up, the things were talking to each other, and they didn't seem happy. That piqued my interest, and I lifted my head. One was gesturing wildly. It wore an odd garment and had a shiny object in its hand. Another one, that seemed older somehow, was talking without gestures. Finally, the one with the shiny thing nodded. Then the wolf gave a sharp bark towards me. I blinked and looked down. I heard a click and the door opened. My muscles tensed to jump, but it was the wolf that came in and walked over to me. He growled a warning and then opened his mouth and put it over the back of my neck. I lowered my head to the ground. I was angry, but didn't move. That still confused me. I didn't know this wolf, but something stronger than my own mind told me I had no choice but to listen to him. Then I smelled the other thing. My lips curled back and I growled hard. The teeth went deeper and blood wet my fur. Then I felt another sharp stab, this time in my side. I yelped. Suddenly my heart raced faster, and then faster. I had to open my mouth to pant. What had they done to me? Was I dying? Then it slowed. I was gasping when it reached normal pace, but then it slowed even more. My vision went blurry again, but I didn't see blackness. Not able to hold myself up any longer, I collapsed. Then I felt hands on me, laying me on my side. Sounds swarmed around me, but I felt my body going cold. I blinked and realized I was dying. I was dying without my wolf. He said he would come. My heart beat slower, and I felt the life slip away from me. Please save me, I thought. And then darkness did take me and my life. Somewhere in that darkness I floated, and then the pain hit hard. It slammed into me, and I threw back my neck and howled a deep howl of agony. My skin seemed to peel back on itself, and my bones cracked and inverted. The pain was white hot, and I screamed again and again. As I did, the scream changed. My sounds changed. And then the darkness came again. This time, when I woke, I saw the light behind my closed eyelids first. I blinked them open, my head throbbing. My mind was scrambled. I smacked my lips and then gasped as the face appeared inches from my own. I swung at a reflex, but wasn't fast enough. "Ray, it's me. Track," I heard, and I stopped fighting. I looked up at him and then pulled one of my hands out of his own and put it on my forehead, which was still throbbing. "What happened?" He frowned. "You don't remember?" I bunched up my brows in thought, and then shook my head, which only made matters worse. He sighed. "I'm not sure if that's better or worse," he mumbled. I turned my head and saw Jonathan and my dad walking over to me. I smiled at them and they smiled back. Jonathan leaned over and kissed my forehead. A strange sensation swept through me and then was gone. When he pulled back a bit, he shook his head. "You certainly know how to keep us guys on our toes," he chuckled. I bit my lower lip. I shifted and did something bad, didn't I? Jonathan smiled and shrugged. "Well, let's just say you gave us a run for our money. What do you remember?" I narrowed my eyes. "Not much. Well, my eyes widened. I got out, didn't I?" Track stiffened, but Jonathan nodded. I tried to sit up, and he reached behind me and helped me, pushing the pillows behind me. "I remember running outside," I stated, searching for the memories. That's all I could find. There were others, but they were so mixed together I couldn't sort them out. Track watched me carefully. I noticed and frowned. "How bad is it?" "Is what?" Jonathan asked, drawing my attention back to him. "Whatever's making Track look at me that way." Jonathan shot him a hard look, then chuckled at me. "You had 3/4 of the security staff after you for several hours, but no one was hurt." I sighed in relief. I didn't hurt anyone. That was a good thing. "Maybe she'll remember more," Track mumbled, turning away from me and Jonathan. My dad stepped up, and they both moved so he could sit on my bed. "Reina, sweetheart," he smiled, "you had us all very worried." "I'm sorry, Daddy," I said softly, meaning it. I could remember the smells of the outside and the feel of the ground under my feet, but that was all. Track's phone rang and I looked at him. He winked at me but stood up and walked away to answer it. My dad rubbed a hand over mine. "If you want Alyssa to leave, you could have just said so," he chuckled. Alyssa! I remembered her coming into the room and me bolting out. "Does she know it was me?" He shook his head. "No, she still thinks it was Track's mate." I nodded, and he shrugged. We locked down the manor and had all the guests sequestered to their rooms. The shields were down, so there was no way for her to know. "Thank you," I whispered, and he shook his head. "You're my daughter, my life. There's very little I wouldn't do for you. Protecting your privacy is a given," he winked. And then I shrugged. "Seems you've had to do a lot of that lately." "It keeps things interesting." We both chuckled then. I heard Track's voice rise a bit and looked over, but he lowered it again and was too far away for me to hear. Then a panic swept over me. I sat up straight and started to look around. "What is it?" my dad asked, concern returning to his face. My eyes scanned the room. "I don't know," I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. "I feel like I'm missing something." I noticed Track stiffen, and I looked at him. He said something into the phone and clicked it, shoving it back into his pocket. I shook my head. I'm not sure what, though." Jonathan was on the other side of my bed now, and I turned to him. He smiled. "You're still disoriented." I frowned, nodded, and then watched Track walk back over. His eyes were on me, watching me and trying to read me. I frowned under his heavy gaze and turned back to my dad. "How long was I gone?" "About 5 hours," he stated seriously, and I shook my head. That feeling was still there, like I had lost something very important. I slid a hand to my throat. The necklace was there. "Is this how you found me?" He nodded. "The signal was lost a few times, but we were able to locate you." "So, was it that, then?" I wanted to reach under my pillow and see if Wolfie was there, but I didn't. It seemed more than that somehow. I frowned, trying to remember. trying to find the reason for this ache that was growing inside of me. My nose started to tingle, and I glanced towards the door as if I expected it to open. Finally, I shook my head to clear it and asked what time it was. Jonathan informed me it was 6 a.m. "The day of the party," my dad added, smiling. "The party!" I gasped. Maybe that was it. Maybe I was worried that I had missed it and that everything had to be put on hold. But it was only 6 a.m. I stopped and waited to see if that made the feeling go away. But it didn't. It was fading now. It didn't go completely away, but it didn't feel like my heart was being squeezed so tightly. I drew in a slow breath. "So what happens now?" "That all depends on you," my dad replied. "You're to stay put in bed for a while. We'll go off of how you're doing." "And the party?" "It will wait if needed," Jonathan announced, and I frowned. Great, just great. Hundreds of people, all possibly here for nothing, if I couldn't get better control. I was doing so good. What happened to change that? Alyssa. She sparked something in me, the wolf in me that made me lose focus. I had to overcome that, now. The door did open then, and I whipped my head around, my eyes wide and expecting. Exactly what I was expecting I had no idea, but my heart fluttered a bit. Then I saw Michael and a doctor walked in. I sighed sadly and sat back against the pillows. Trax stared at me, and I looked at him. His eyes seemed so sad. I frowned, but he smiled at me. "Breakfast time." I chuckled and took the thermos after it was checked. I put it to my mouth and then gagged. I put my hand over my mouth, flew out of bed and into the bathroom where I had to spit it into the sink. The red liquid splashed back up over my t-shirt and neck. I stood there with my hands on the sides of the sink, shaking a bit. Jonathan rushed in and I whispered, "What's wrong with me this time?" He grabbed a washcloth, turned on the faucet, and then put it under. "Your wolf side was very strong this time. You're probably still leveling out." He started to wash the liquid off my neck. "Or it could be that during this shift you won't need to feed." "At least not this way." We turned to see Track walk in with a clean t-shirt in his hand. He held it out to me and I thanked him. When I took it, I looked at them both and they turned around. I sighed and yanked the stained one off, tossed it in the hamper and finished cleaning up, then pulled the clean one on. When they turned back around, we all walked into my room. My dad helped me into the bed. "I actually feel fine," I stated as he pulled the blankets over my lap. "Well, you'll rest for a while and then we'll go from there," he stated. Track's phone rang again and he stepped away to answer it. "Cell phones are so annoying," I chuckled, and then my dad's went off. He looked at me and I rolled my eyes. He stood to answer it, walking away as well. "Your turn," I said to Jonathan, but he shook his head. "I have it on vibrate and have no plans to answer it just now." "So what happened?" I asked. He shrugged. "Well, the short version is that you took off, ran into the forest. Like your dad said, the tracking device wasn't as great as we thought, so the pack came to help. I didn't go into the forest. I came back here to try to pinpoint your location. It took them a long time to find you, and..." "And?" He chuckled. "Well, the pack finally had to call Ryan and one of his wolves in." "Why?" I gasped, seeing Track turn a little. He was listening to us as well as whoever was on the phone. "It seems you decided you weren't going to be taken," Jonathan smiled. "You put up a good fight." My eyes widened. "Since they didn't want to hurt you, they called in Ryan. He was able to get enough control over the situation to get you out so they could bring you back." "Great. How embarrassing," I moaned into my lap. Jonathan smiled and leaned closer. "I always knew you were a fighter." I grinned then. I am so sorry, Jonathan, I whispered. I didn't mean to do that. Of course you didn't, he stated. So don't you be sorry. Like I keep telling you, none of this is your fault. You're gaining more and more control. Yeah, but it seems like I just took a very big step backwards. Alyssa seems to trigger something in you. Maybe jealousy? He winked, and I rolled my eyes. He laughed and put his hand on mine. I looked down at it and then tilted my head, that strange feeling of loss gurgling inside me again. What is it? He asked. I don't know. Just an odd feeling, like I can't explain it. Track walked back over and plopped down on the side of my bed my dad had been on. The guys just wanted to make sure you were okay. I am so sorry, Track. Please tell them how sorry I am. He held up a hand and I went quiet. Then he looked at me hard. Phil and the guys just wanted to know you were okay. Phil. Phil. Why did that name do something? My Alpha, of course. I had probably put him through a lot out there, especially if he had to go get Ryan involved. Track was watching me hard again. My eyes were wide, but I blinked under his heavy stare. Why do you keep doing that? He shook his head. You're something else, but he smiled. Is that a good something else or a bad something else? No comment, he stated, and I smacked his arm. Finally, my dad hung up, and the doctor walked over and talked to him. Then they both came to the bedside. I sighed and leaned back on the pillows, in position for the exam. I was fine until he went to take blood. As soon as I felt the needle, a wave of panic came over me, and I jumped, pushing him away. Track moved in front of me quickly, standing between me and the doctor. My dad looked at me. What is it? I don't know, but that needle, I shivered. Track leaned into my dad's ear, and he nodded, then turned to the doctor. No more needles, he stated. But, sir, I have to get a sample. I said no more needles, my dad hissed. The doctor nodded and headed back to his caddy. I rubbed my arm, the tiny prick of blood already clotted. I was wondering why I had reacted that way when Jonathan started to talk about the party. He said Aunt Mary was a bit beside herself about my hair, of all things, but that she had her hairdresser on standby. I laughed and relaxed a little. There was a knock on the door then. When it opened, Ryan walked in. I tilted my head as he came over, his dirty blonde hair sparking something in my memory that wouldn't quite surface. But from what Jonathan told me, I should probably be thankful for that. I lowered my eyes as he walked over. Track moved, but stood next to the head of my bed. Ryan glanced at him, but then turned to me. So, how are you feeling? I shrugged. Fine. He drew in a slow breath. What exactly are we going to do with you? He said with a slight chuckle. I was really getting sick of hearing that phrase. Was I really so bad that nobody knew what to do with me? That hurt. In fact, it hurt a lot. My nose started to tingle and I swallowed hard. How much do you remember? I shrugged. Not much, but Jonathan gave me the basics. He nodded. I see. Then he looked at Track, who shook his head. Ryan sighed again. I am sorry, I whispered, looking down at the blanket. For what? The alpha of the Polson pack laughed. For making you have to come do whatever you had to do. Your pack, Reina. You're my pack. That's what we do. I seem to be a lot of trouble lately. He laughed. That's true enough. I glanced up at him, my eyes watering now. The smile left his face and his eyes softened. Reina, you can't help that this is happening to you. You have both wolf and vampire in you. I can't imagine anyone holding up as well as you have. I frowned and he nodded. You're gaining control. You're working through it. And most importantly, he reached over and lifted my chin. You are not going to give up. He raised his brows and I nodded submissively. He let go of my chin. This will all sort itself out to whatever end is supposed to be. He glanced at Track again, who looked down. What is it supposed to be? I whispered, a slight plea in my voice. I don't know, Reina, but I do know you're strong enough to see it through. I don't feel strong. Maybe not at this moment, but you are actually quite amazing. I huffed and he nodded. You have already done so many things that have never been done before. Like act like a complete idiot and upset everyone? No, he smiled. You know what I mean. There went that alpha voice. Phil, I mean Ryan. My head shot up and my eyes widened, and I glanced at the door with that odd feeling again. Ryan's eyes narrowed and Track watched me. Sorry, I said with a soft smile. I just wanted to say thank you for helping me. However you did it. Pack, Reina, how many times do I have to tell you that? I nodded, and Ryan reached out his hand. Why don't you give me that necklace so they can check it out? I slipped it over my head and placed it in his palm. This thing was nearly useless, he growled at it, closing his fist around it. But we do need to get something on you to keep you safe. My eyes widened. What exactly did he have in mind? Since we don't have anything else, we'll have to hope these highly paid scientists can fix this thing to withstand a wolf running through the forest and swimming down river several times to cover her scent. He winked at me and I bit my lower lip. Dang, that was pretty smart of me. I didn't understand why I did it, but a small spark of pride peeked out. Maybe it was the smile that Ryan, this was Ryan, that Ryan gave me. I shook my head hard and he frowned. What is it? Just things get a little mixed up in here, I said, rubbing my forehead. No point lying to the main alpha. It wasn't possible that I knew of. Mixed up how? Like calling you Phil, I explained. Ah, that was all he said. Jonathan smiled at me. Well, I think after all you went through, mixing one alpha's name with the other isn't cause for alarm. Ryan and Track looked at him and then at each other. Pack wolves did that a lot. Those silent looks that held a complete conversation in a glance that no one else understood. Even me at the moment, apparently. What Jonathan said made sense. They were both my alphas, and Phil had been around more lately. Is everyone still coming to the party? I asked, suddenly wanting to change the subject. Ryan smiled. Everyone who can come will, he stated, and then stood. As for me, I'd better get back so that I don't end up being late. I grinned up at him, and then he leaned down and hugged me tightly. It felt good to have his arms around me. He was forgiving me for whatever I had done. Then he looked at Track and headed towards the door. Track glanced at me. I'll be right back. Then he followed Ryan out. I watched them leave and Jonathan tapped my hand. Allison called while you were busy. I turned to look at him and he smiled. She said that if you needed a friend to talk to before the party, to give her a call. His smile changed for a second. I guess she's worried that you'll be nervous. Nervous? I had kind of forgotten about being nervous. With all that had happened, it didn't seem that big of a deal. I mean, nerves-wise. I looked over at my dresser. Have you seen my phone? He stood, reached into his back pocket and pulled it out. When you shifted and, ruined another set of clothes, it fell out, he smiled. I shook my head, taking it. Thanks. I need to call Phil and apologize. For some reason, this seemed very important. I looked at my phone. Do I have his number in here? Jonathan frowned and thought, I think so. Hit the contact button and then scroll through the names. If not, I think I have it. He pulled out his own phone and started looking through it, as I did when he said with my own. Here it is, I stated, and then hit the talk button. I smiled over at him as I put the phone to my ear. It rang and rang. Just when I thought it would go to his voicemail, I heard the click. Hello? My brows knitted. Rock? Hey, Reina, came a voice that seemed a little tense. Hey, is Phil there? There was a brief pause. Yeah, but he's a little busy right this sec. Oh. Why that made me sad, I don't know. Well, I was just calling to tell him, and the rest of you, sorry, and thanks for last night. A nervous chuckle. No problem, pup. You keep things exciting around here. I smiled down at my blanket. Will you tell him I called and pass that message to whoever else helped? You bet. You're packed, Reina. You don't have to do that. You know that, right? I sighed softly, my voice low. I know. That's why I need to. Rock? Yeah? Are you sure Phil can't come to the phone? I really wanted to tell him myself. Another long pause. He can't, Reina, came a voice that seemed edged with frustration. Is everything okay? Compared to when, he chuckled, and that made me smile. Well, please make sure you tell him I called, okay? There was a pleading in my voice. But why shouldn't there be? I had Ryan's forgiveness, now I needed my click alphas. I will see you tonight. Okay, bye. When I shut the phone, I realized how early it was and flinched. I probably woke them up, I said. No wonder he said Phil was busy. He was probably still asleep. But Rock didn't sound like he was. I shrugged it off and Jonathan grinned at me. As I went to hand him my phone, I noticed a message alert. I sighed. It was probably someone about the party. Ignoring it, I changed my mind and just sat it on the nightstand. My dad came back over and told me that the doctors would be working on my necklace. I nodded and laid back against my pillows. Something was nagging at me inside, and I didn't know what it was. My memories of the night before were sketchy at best, just flashes of moments and very few of those. Normally, I remembered the time I spent as a wolf. Why was this time so different? Chapter 25. From Phil. Back in Polson, Phil laid on a cot, his bandages still red with blood from the injuries underneath. He looked around the small room at the 8 faces there. Rock, Jackson, Marcus, and Miles, plus 4 older ones from a higher clique. He remembered the scene in the cave. They had beaten him up pretty bad. When they came for Reina, he had fought and fought hard. He had attacked his alpha and his own clique to keep them from taking her. My mate, he thought, turning his head to look at the wall. I will come for you. He was glad they couldn't hear his thoughts when they were on 2 legs. He sat up when the door opened and Ryan walked in. Everyone's face was somber and they all looked at him. But he walked over and sat on the chair next to the cot. I've talked with Reina, he said quietly, although everyone could hear. What did she say? Phil asked, flinching as he sat up more. Is she okay? He knew she had fought them too, trying to stay with him. She's okay. A little shaken still. But Phil? Ryan sighed, his head shaking slowly. She doesn't remember anything about last night. What? He shouted, shaking his head. But she has to. What happened between us? His voice trailed off as Ryan shook his head again. I have to go see her, Phil stated. throwing the covers off and wincing at the pain in his side. Ryan put his hand up. No, I told you, you will stay away from her. You can't do that to me, Ryan. I'm not asking, he stated hard, the alpha voice strong. Phil shook his head again. She may not remember now, but she will remember, and then what? Will you keep me locked up here forever? Phil looked towards the door. I have to see her. Rock and Jackson walked up, their faces tight with worry. They were torn. They had seen what had happened. They had witnessed what passed between their clique alpha and their pack sister. It was real. They all knew that. Now they were posted here at the order of their other alpha to keep the two of them apart. Their loyalties were divided 3 ways, and the internal struggle was showing. She's getting ready for the party, Ryan said flatly. Phil growled, You can't let her go through with it. She will remember, and then she'll want to know why I didn't come, why no one told her. Ryan sighed. I don't know that she will remember. When she shifted this time, I couldn't communicate with her. None of the pack could. She was completely wild and had no memories, even of us. We don't know that she'll ever remember what happened, and it isn't likely she will shift that way again. I'll find a way to see her, Phil hissed. I had hoped you'd given up on that. Never, he whispered. She is my mate. I can never be with another. Ever, Phil hissed with conviction. Ryan's eyes lifted. You'll learn to let this go. You will let Reina have her life, and if I have to ship you off for a while to do it, I will, he stated slowly, with a threat heavy on his words. It doesn't matter. I will find a way. Ryan growled. She is announcing herself to be another's mate tonight, he shouted, which made everyone in the room go tense. You will not leave this room until it is over, and then you will not try to take her from the vampire. Phil gave a soft chuckle. She is not his. Ryan stood, looming over the cot, the veins in his thick neck pulsing. Understand this. You were there. You saw that she didn't remember anything about us or her vampire life. You should not have let it go as far as it did. Your job was to find her and get her home to the manor. That's exactly what I intended to do, he snapped back, throwing his legs over the side and crying out a little as he did. He looked at his alpha hard. I never had thoughts of Reina as my mate, ever, in the slightest. I went there to do just that. But then something happened. It happens that way with werewolves, and you know it, Ryan. Not with her. This time, yes, with her. I went out there to take her back, and it just happened. We connected on that level that ties 2 wolves together forever. There's no changing that. We can't stop it. You know that too. Ryan leaned down a little. She doesn't remember it, Phil. But she will, and I do. Unless she does, and completely on her own, which I doubt, you will stay away from her and let her live her life. I will never be able to be without her. You will find a way, Ryan hissed. You will do whatever it takes to keep your feelings inside. How can you do that to her? Phil hissed back. Let her do what she's about to do without even telling her the truth? And what is the truth? Ryan roared, starting to pace. That this shift turned her into a completely wild wolf? That she and I are mates, Phil shot back, grabbing his ribs as he did. You are not. His clique wolves stepped up next to him, all watching Phil carefully. Ryan's veins in his neck were bulging now. You are not mates. Understand that, Phil. You let things get out of hand. She doesn't remember. Ryan shook his head, turning away. She has no feelings for you outside of the pack. Phil flinched at those words, but he knew Ryan was just trying to make him angry enough to let her go. How can he take her when he knows what happened? He doesn't know, Ryan sighed. He wasn't in the forest or at the cave. No one told him? Phil asked, his face tight with anger. Why not? He needs to know. If you won't tell Reina, he paused as her name tightened in his throat, then you need to tell him. He should know before the party. Why tell him? Ryan growled. There's no point. What happened out there happened because she was wild and couldn't control her shift. She ran from her own home. She ran from her pack and fought them too. She wasn't able to think clearly. He sat back down, leaning forward and lacing his fingers together to keep from hitting something. Reina has gone through a lot. It's always been hard for her, even before her shifting started. Now she has doctors probing her, guards doubled, and we have to keep a pack brother there to watch over her. Her life has been twisted, and she has been spun around too many times. Let her have something normal, Phil. Phil drew in a slow breath. When she remembers, she'll ask why you kept it from her. Ryan shrugged. I don't think she will remember, but if that day comes, I'll tell her what I'm telling you now. He stood then. You're not going to the party. Since Rock, Miles, Marcus, and Jackson have to go, I will have more pack brothers take their place here to make sure you stay put. She'll wonder why I'm not there. Ryan nodded. Your injuries will explain that. It will take you a few days to heal completely. And if she wants to come and see me? Ryan drew in a long, slow breath. The weight of all that had happened was weighing heavy on him. The pack was his life and his responsibility. Nothing like this had happened before. He was talking to the elders and getting their advice. They all agreed that her not remembering meant it wasn't real to her. It was more like a dream. He looked at his sub-alpha. Phil had always been strong and level-headed, but he saw pain in his face now. Pain that had nothing to do with the injuries. Whether it was real to Reina or not, it was very real to Phil. What happened in that forest had changed him. In his mind, Reina was his mate, and very little, if anything, could change that. He pitied his friend, and he did consider Phil a friend. He was laying here, in love with Reina, and she was about to announce herself belonging to another. His heart went out to Phil, but he had to keep the whole pack in mind. If he had told Reina, or even Jonathan, what would happen? The vampire would probably say that Phil took advantage of her. That would cause a bigger problem. Or the vampire would leave her, then she would be heartbroken and alone over something she didn't even remember. Reina, well, telling her was not an option. She had been through too much already. Werewolves treated the females in their packs differently. They were watched over more, cared for, and probably spoiled, although that could be to compensate for the tight rules they had to live under. They were held very closely to the pack, and hurting them was not something that was done. Ryan and the others were still having a hard time with what they had to do last night. It was done to protect her, but it still didn't set well with any of them. They were all in a foul mood for it, and it left a bad taste in their mouth. I know this is hard for you, Ryan finally said, but you need to understand. You have no idea what this is doing to me, Phil whispered, his head down. And I don't understand, Ryan. Wolves finding their mate, finding that natural and complete connection, is supposed to be honored. He was looking at his own hands now. The scrapes and cuts there were minor and had almost completely healed. Phil, if you and Reina had hooked up under different circumstances, we would be in a very different stance right now. If it were outside of her shifting, the pack and I would stand with you against anyone," he sighed. "Vampires and werewolves weren't always friends. That ground is still shaky at times." "I love her, Ryan." "And she loves a vampire named Jonathan," he replied, his words low and filled with guilt for having to say such things. Having Reina become coupled with a vampire, even one that seemed to want to embrace her wolf side, was also hard on the pack. Losing a pack sister to another pack did happen, and no one liked it, but at least she was still in a pack. They were losing Reina to a packless vampire. Ryan closed his eyes. A part of him had always thought that Track and Reina would be together. They were inseparable since he was a pup. He had broken many pack rules because of her. Instead, in some bizarre twist of fate or science, it was Phil. "What if someone told you you couldn't have had Allison?" Phil whispered. "That's different, and you know it," Ryan growled. "I know, but put all that aside and just think how it would make you feel." "It would drive me mad," Ryan hissed. "Things are very different here. Phil, just because I can fathom your pain doesn't mean I'm going to agree with you about it. She belongs here, with us." Rock and Jackson stirred then. That hit a chord. Like Ryan, none of them liked the fact that Reina getting with a vampire meant that they would eventually lose her. "She will still be pack. That doesn't ever change." "Maybe, but think about when they actually marry, or union, whatever vampires call it." Phil looked up. "He says he understands her wolf side. He has met us, befriended us, but he does plan on taking her away." Ryan frowned and Phil nodded. "Trax said that the vampire is already looking for a place for them to live. Do you really think he is going to let us around her then?" Ryan cleared his throat. "Her father will make sure that she has what she needs if she leaves the manor." Phil's shoulders shook in a silent laugh. "And what is he going to do if she shifts and has problems?" Another tender spot. Vampires were capable, but they were that. Vampires. Wolves didn't like others taking care of their own when they were hurt or having problems. "Like I said, Phil, her father will see to it that she is taken care of. I will talk to him and make sure that there are wolves working security at least." "I love Reina and she loves me. Don't expect that I'm just going to roll over to this vampire. She is mine." Phil's voice was whispered, low, but steady. Ryan shook his head. "I would never expect you to roll over to a vampire, but you will roll over to me." His voice deepened again, the authority seeping out with it. Phil lowered his head but went quiet. Ryan looked up at the others. He told the 4 to go and gave them names of 4 others to send back in their place. He waited until those 4 arrived. Then he faced the 8 wolves. "There is 1 door here and no windows. If he manages to get out, each of you will pay more than dearly." The wolves nodded, and then Ryan left as well. Reina. When I was finally given the all clear, I hopped out of bed and got into the shower. I put jeans and a t-shirt on that were still, since there was still several hours I had to get ready for the party. It just felt good to be out of that bed. Track was the only one in my room when I walked back in. I smiled at him. "Can't wait to see you all dressed up tonight." He gave a small grin. "Yeah, don't get used to it." "Where is everyone?" "Party stuff," he stated, and I nodded. "So I'm out of bed, but I'm stuck in the room?" "They just said to keep you out of trouble," he chuckled. "Not the easiest task." I bit my lower lip. What else happened last night? He sighed and shrugged. You already heard the basics. No point going over it again. I frowned, but there's something nagging at me. His brows went up, but he stayed quiet. I nodded. I don't know what it is, but it feels like it's important. Like I'm forgetting something that matters. A lot. I shook my head. I don't think I'm even explaining it right, but it's frustrating. Well, have you worked through your memories? About the party, I mean. Maybe you're thinking that you forgot something you were supposed to do. No, it's not the party, really. I wrinkled my nose. But it does kind of seem like, I looked around and then shrugged. Like I need to figure it out before the party. I looked at my closet. I have the dress, the shoes, the other things. I shot him a look, expecting some comment, but he was standing there with an almost sad look on his face. What's wrong? I asked and started to walk towards him. Reina, how bad is this thing bothering you? He asked quietly. I shrugged. I guess a lot. I can't shake it. He frowned and my brows wrinkled. What is it? Then the door opened and Jonathan walked in. He smiled at me and I smiled back. I don't know how long I can hold Aunt Mary off, he chuckled, walking over to me and kissing my cheek. I frowned a bit when he did. The touch of his lips on my skin sent an odd wave of emotion through me, one I couldn't understand. I felt Track watching me closely. I looked up at Jonathan. The hairdresser, I sighed. When he nodded, I groaned. Jonathan, I don't want big poofy hair. He laughed hard then. I don't see Aunt Mary doing that, do you? When I bit my lower lip, he smiled. If you want to leave your hair like it is, then I'll tell her, and that'll be that. I reached up and stroked my very straight, very plain hair. Well, maybe something a little fancier? He took my hand and squeezed it. Nervous? Yeah, now I was. My stomach felt like things were dancing around inside of it, and that something was still buzzing in my mind. A little, I stated. Perfectly normal, came Aunt Mary's voice as she and a younger female walked in. I sniffed, not realizing it. The other was full vampire as well. Aunt Mary ordered Track and Jonathan out. Jonathan smiled, kissed my cheek. Track, however, didn't smile. He watched my eyes as he stood in front of me. I'll be right outside. I winked at him and they left. Aunt Mary and her hairdresser spent an hour discussing my hair and different possible styles. They asked me what I liked and didn't like, and then they finally seemed to decide on one. We'll come back 2 hours before we leave to start getting you ready, Aunt Mary said, smiling at me. 2 hours to get ready, I gasped, remembering the episode before Beamer's. What was it with 2 hours before? She laughed. Oh, my dear, yes, 2 hours at least. Then she winked and they left. I saw Track on his phone in the hallway. He turned to me, said something into it, then shoved it in his pocket. Jonathan walked in first. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was noon. I still had 4 hours before it was time to leave. The party was to start at 7, but my dad wanted me there a bit early, so they wouldn't be trying to get me inside while the guests were arriving. Aunt Mary said it will take me 2 hours to get ready, I told Jonathan, my face showing my confusion. He chuckled and looked at the clock, mentally going through the same calculations. Well then, that gives us 2 hours until they swoop you up. Track walked in and I looked at him. When do you have to leave to get ready? I suddenly didn't want him to go, even for a short time. My mom sent my clothes here, he stated flatly. I'll be riding with you. Rock will be coming with us too. Oh, I stated. Something was bothering him, and he looked both sad and angry at the same time. My phone rang, and I walked over to it. Track was standing behind me when I looked at the screen. It was Allison. He blew out his breath and I shot him a hard look when I pushed the answer button. I saw the icon that told me I still had a message, but I quickly forgot about it as Allison's excited voice blared in my ear. She asked how I was doing, worried that I was nervous, and felt bad for not being here. I assured her I was fine, and it took 10 minutes to convince her of it. Finally, I hung up. I went to put the phone in my back pocket. Then I remembered I wouldn't be wearing my jeans. My dress didn't have any pockets, so I walked over to where the pretty purse was that Alyssa gave me. I opened it and dropped the phone inside. The next 2 hours went by too fast. Aunt Mary found the three of us in my sitting room watching a movie. She announced that I now belonged to her, or at least until we were ready to leave. She was already dressed in a beautiful cream dress with beading at the hem and waistband. Her hair was up in a soft bun, and I told her how beautiful she looked. I was pulled down to my bedroom, and my transformation began. 2 hours later, Aunt Mary walked to the doors and threw them open. She turned to me, and I stepped out, slowly, with my head down a little. Jonathan smiled wide, Track whistled low, and Michael and Martin's eyes were wide. The hairdresser put my hair up in a soft updo, as she called it. She even got my very straight hair to curl into ringlets around the base of my neck. Then she put pins in that were either dark blue or silver-colored at the tips, making it look like they were laid on my hair. I had very little makeup on, Aunt Mary agreeing it just wasn't me otherwise. The lipstick felt odd on my mouth, but she chose a soft color for that as well. I fidgeted under the stairs, and Aunt Mary laughed. Speechless. See there, Reina? They are speechless. The hairdresser handed me my purse that now contained touch-up makeup and a small mirror as well as my phone. Jonathan's eyes sparkled as he stepped up. You are beyond beautiful, he whispered, and my head lowered even more. He lifted my chin. Don't look down, Reina. This is your night. You both look great, too, I mumbled, though they looked more than great. Jonathan looked amazing in his tailored suit and beautiful blue shirt that matched my dress. He had opted for the full suit when we had found my dress, although he said he would probably only wear the jacket for the announcement. Track was in a dark gray suit with a black shirt. He looked so handsome and older somehow. I smiled at him and he winked back. That thought was buzzing louder now. Something there, almost yelling at me to remember it. I couldn't see what could be more important than this, so I pushed it aside and took the arm that he held out. We met up with my dad, looking amazing in his very elegant suit, and Jonathan's dad, sporting an expensive suit as well. Men just didn't have the fashion choices women did, but they all looked great. As we walked towards the garage, Rock walked up. He wore a deep blue suit that almost looked black, with a black shirt, which was the reason you could tell the rest wasn't black. He smiled when he saw me and looked me over hard. Look at you, our pup, all dressed up. I chuckled and we continued to the garage. My stomach tightened then and I put a hand to it. The odd feeling got louder the closer we got to the waiting cars, and I looked around as if I could see the reason for the odd pull. Jonathan lifted me up into the SUV, since I couldn't very well climb up in a dress. I sat facing the front, Jonathan next to me and my dad on the other side. Jonathan's dad sat across from us with Rock and Track. The drive was pretty quiet. I kept trying to look outside. At one point, my dad offered to switch places and I agreed. He moved around me and I turned to the window, watching the scenery pass by. When a span of thick trees took up the skyline, I tilted my head. I tried to see through them, but they were too thick and were moving too fast. It was still light outside, which also helped hide the secrets of the forest. "The forest," I whispered, and my dad turned to me. "What was that, sweetheart?" "Nothing." He nodded and returned to his conversation with Jonathan's dad. But I felt two heavy stares and turned a little. Rock and Track were watching me, their faces too serious and their eyes filled with things I didn't understand. I gave them a small smile and then turned back to the window, but the forest was gone. The trees had given way to commercial land. I sighed and sat back against the seat, careful not to squish my hairdo. Just then a cell phone went off and they all turned and looked at me. "Oh," I said, and pulled open my purse. Track looked ready to lunge, and I frowned. What was his problem? When I glanced at the screen, I shrugged. "I don't know. It just shows a number." Track moved then, but my dad had the phone. He looked at it, then pushed the button and said hello. He smiled and turned his head to the window, then back again. "Here she is." He held out the phone. It is Mary." Track relaxed back in his seat, and I put the phone to my ear. "Whatever you do, dear," came her loud voice, "don't lean your head all the way back on the seat. It will mash the hair. I know it's a pain, but after the party it won't matter, so it's only for a little while longer." "Okay," I whispered, wondering if the others could hear. This feminine thing was a bit of a pain. When I went to put the phone back, I noticed that message alert again. I bit my lower lip as I tried to remember how to check my text messages. I pushed a few buttons and only managed to get some odd screen that I didn't understand. The phone went back in my purse and I went back to watching out the window. We pulled up at the private entrance and everyone climbed out before Jonathan helped me out. The guards were there, 5 just for me. "Oh boy," I groaned. As we walked inside, I put a hand over my stomach and slowed. The room spun a little and I felt tingly, like I was going to faint or something. Jonathan and Track grabbed me and I shook my head as the feeling passed. "I'm okay." When neither let go of me, I straightened. "I'm fine now. Just felt a little faint." Odd, because I had never felt faint, but I had seen it enough in movies. "Nerves," Jonathan smiled, and I nodded, trying to smile back. Track and Rock were whispering to each other, and we continued inside. It was breathtaking. Everything was blue and silver, well, silver-colored. The lights around the dance floor were a soft blue. The silver-looking railings were encased in a thick, clear plastic tube of some sort, and then wrapped in beautiful blue ribbons. Every table had a glass vase with various blue flowers peeking out. Jonathan put his hand on the small of my back and pointed at the dance floor. "That's where we'll stand to make the announcement," he smiled. I only nodded. There were guards everywhere, dressed in dark black suits. The help was straightening the blue tablecloths that had silver ones over it crossways. Candles were being brought to life in chrome and blue holders, and I jumped when my dad said something to me. "Our area is over here," he stated, and moved us to a part of the first floor. "The last time I was here, we were up in the private part of the top floor. This time, it seems we would be down here, in the middle of everything." Aunt Mary walked over and smiled. "Isn't this just beautiful?" she exclaimed. Then a man with a fancy camera around his neck stepped up. "We will start the photos on the stairs," he explained. I frowned, but everyone followed. The photographer's helpers arranged us on the stairs, its silver rails also encased in the clear tubing and wrapped in deep blue ribbon with the silver accent bows tied in places, the ribbons flowing downward. They took pictures of me and Jonathan, then just me, then Jonathan, then me and my dad. The list went on and on. Finally, someone stepped up and announced the guests were arriving. My dad turned to me. "You, Jonathan, Mr. Alver, and myself will greet everyone near the inside door." He looked at me, and I nodded mechanically. I hated crowds. We walked over and the photographer got in place. I swallowed hard. That odd feeling started to scream at me. It buzzed so loudly that I barely remembered smiling and being hugged by people I didn't even know. Finally, Jonathan took me and led me back to the area set for us. He sat me on the couch, then moved next to me. "How are you holding up?" I shrugged, and he smiled. "I'm sorry you aren't enjoying this more." I looked at him and remembered just how much it meant to him. I smiled. "I'm sorry. It's just the crowd part. The rest is wonderful." He chuckled. Trax sat on the other side of me. "Should we worry that she still hasn't eaten?" he whispered, and my brows lifted. The last time I tried to eat, I had to run in the bathroom and spit it out. Normally, if I went too long without eating, I became very weak and then very sick. Seems that had changed too. Jonathan nodded. "We'll watch her. We have her thermos just in case." "But she couldn't get it down last time," he whispered back. Jonathan just smiled at me. "She's fine." Track mumbled something under his breath and sat back and watched all the people wander around. Then the music started. The dance floor was quickly filled, and I watched. I found myself scanning the room, a desperate feeling I couldn't explain eating away at me. When people would try to come up and talk to us, the wall of guards would slow them. Then either my dad or Jonathan would step up and talk to them first. There were only a few times that Jonathan turned and had me stand with him to meet someone he thought was important. I didn't remember their names or even their faces. Time swam in a mass of people, color, and music. My head spun as that nagging feeling tried to overpower me. Track's family and the rest of the pack had a special seating area as well. There was food there, wonderful smelling food that I caught the scent of now and then. I had asked about Phil, and Track told me what happened. I felt bad that he had gotten hurt rescuing me. That bothered me a lot. I wanted to call him and talk to him, but Track distracted me with Effie. I laughed as she twirled and showed me her pretty pink and white dress. Her hair was done up with matching ribbons, and she insisted that the photographer take pictures of me and her, which they did. Ryan walked over then, took Effie, and handed her to her older brother Mike. He looked over at me smiling. "I still can't believe it's you," he chuckled. I grinned, lowering my head a little. "You look amazing, Reina." "Thanks. Good thing we were taking pictures, because it's probably the last time you'll see me like this," I chuckled. "At least until the union." We both turned to see Jonathan walking up, smiling. He put his arm around my waist, and I shrugged. "Until then, at least." Jonathan chuckled and then looked at Ryan. Something passed between the two of them in that look, but I missed it. Jonathan hugged me to him a little, and I turned, pretending to be looking at something across the room. Ryan looked at me. "Phil is going to be very sorry he missed this," he stated in a careful tone. Suddenly my nose tingled and my eyes watered. "Don't mess up the makeup," I could hear Aunt Mary's voice call out in my mind. I swallowed hard, putting a hand on my stomach. It seemed to bother me a lot that my Click Alpha wasn't there. Maybe it was guilt, since it was my fault he wasn't. "Maybe I should call him," I said, looking around for my purse. "We're making the announcement in just a few minutes," Jonathan smiled. "How about you call him right after that?" I nodded, still frowning. I looked up at Ryan and noticed he had to force the smile back onto his lips. I tilted my head, and then my dad walked up. "You two almost ready?" Jonathan nodded. "You bet we are." Ryan took a step closer to me, and I looked up at him. "Maybe you could give him a quick call. He might like that," he said with an odd smile. I nodded. "I'd like that too," I said sincerely. Suddenly, hearing my other alpha's voice seemed very important. "I feel like I need to hear his voice," I whispered, as if talking to myself. Ryan reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "You can do this after," Jonathan chuckled. "They're almost ready for us." Ryan eyed him hard. "It'll only take a moment." He pushed a button, then held the phone to his own ear. "Hello? Thomas, it's Ryan. Put Phil on the phone." I smiled wider, and Ryan gave me a wink, but his eyes were too focused to sparkle. I watched him, my hand starting to reach out for the phone. Then the music stopped, and someone with a microphone started to talk. "That's our cue," Jonathan announced. He looked at Ryan. "She can talk to him later." Then he pulled me away. I turned and looked over my shoulder. As Ryan turned, the phone still to his ear. "It would only take a second to say hello," I whispered in his ear. "And here they are, everyone. Put your hands together for Reina Beldrin and Jonathan Hilvar." The clapping and hooting was deafening. Jonathan looked at me, smiling, and I shrugged and followed him. The dance floor was empty now, except for one man in a suit with a microphone. A spotlight was on us now, so although everyone can see us, it made it very hard to see them. Jonathan took the microphone, and the man stepped off the sunken floor. "Friends and family, Reina and I want to thank you all for coming to witness and help celebrate this exciting and important moment in our lives." The crowd exploded again, people shouting happily, whistling and clapping. Jonathan held my hand, and I don't remember much of what he said. I stood there smiling, but all I could think about was getting back to Ryan and talking to Phil on his phone. Why was that consuming me so much? Then Jonathan let go of my hand and put his arm around my waist. "Reina and I would like to announce that we are now, officially," he chuckled and looked at me, "a couple." It was done. The noise was more than deafening now, and he leaned forward and kissed me. Then he pulled me into his arms, smiled, and kissed me harder. I remember the kiss, but I don't remember how I felt about it. I seemed to be on autopilot, and when Jonathan finally walked us up the 2 steps to greet everyone as a couple, I wondered what had just happened. I knew what had happened, but I didn't remember it happening. I had been so consumed by other thoughts that I had missed it all. I frowned a little and looked down as Jonathan's friends stepped up to shake his hands and hug me. My cheeks were covered with kisses from strangers, and I wanted to go home and take a shower for some reason. I wanted to stand under the water and have all this wash away. I caught a glance of Ryan on his phone, and I sighed, as there was no way I could make that call yet, but I planned to, the first chance I could get. Back in Polson, Thomas closed his phone. His face was tight with anger. He turned to the cot across the room and gave a soft nod. "No!" came a loud cry, and then it turned into a howl filled with rage and pain. Soon another howl joined it, then another and another. The small town of Polson, those that didn't make it to the party, joined Phil in his pain and anger, and the howling continued for most of the night. In the small, windowless room, Phil lowered his head into his hands, a tear running down his cheek. "I will come for you," he whispered. The end.